and handsome face. Don't forget to mute your microphone and sit comfortably. Okay? Okay. Wow, so handsome. Now let's start our event. Welcome to our 12th series of Dev Talk with our spectacular expert here, Professor Dr. Christian von Lübke. Today, we will discuss something unique about development in others' view. Do you already know the topic, guys? Have you know about topic we bring here? Is there anyone who wants to answer my question? So the topic is how do we conceptualize development, ideas of modernization, dependency, and neoliberalism in comparison. I, Christopher Jason, the master of ceremony today, will lead this event today, 12 Dev Talk. For your information, Development Talk is a series of academic discussion hosted by Department of Development Studies, Faculty of Creative Design and Digital Business Creabis, 10 November, Institute of Technology, ITS, to address various important topics related to development. This main topic, development, is ranging from society, public policy, community empowerment, law reinforcement, economics, and communication. Since 2020, DevTalk has invited many experts, practitioners, and policymakers around the world to deliver speeches on some important or current hot issues in development. Before we start our main event today, let us pray first for today's event according to our own belief. Let's pray. Amen. The time for prayer is done. Now, please be seated in a formal manner for our national anthem Indonesia Raya, followed by the ITS hymn, continued also with a video about the Department of Development Studies.
Sanalah aku berdiri, jadi pandu adalah negeri agraris dan maritim dengan luas total wilayah lebih 7,8 juta kilometer dan total penduduknya lebih dari 270 juta jiwa. Dikenal sebagai negeri yang subur makmur dan gemah ripaloh jinawi, tentunya Indonesia juga tidak lepas dari permasalahan pembangunan yang multidimensional. Kecanggihan teknologi serta ketersediaan sumber daya alam saja tidak akan menjamin tercapainya keberhasilan pembangunan. Kebijakan dalam pembangunan tidak seharusnya hanya menitikberatkan sisi sains dan teknologi, akan tetapi juga mengintegrasikan dimensi manusia maupun dimensi sosial. Melalui pengembangan social engineering dan pendekatan multidisipliner dengan diperkuat oleh dukungan multi-stakeholder menjadi daya dorong kreativitas serta inovasi sesuai dengan kepentingan kemanusiaan serta memenuhi kebutuhan pembangunan yang berkelanjutan. Untuk itu, diperlukan modal sumber daya manusia dan didukung oleh ekosistem sosial yang kondusif. Modal sosial harus dipersiapkan melalui penyediaan sumber daya manusia yang terlatih dan terdidik.
Selamat datang di program Studi Pembangunan Fakultas Desain Kreatif dan Bisnis Digital Institut Teknologi 10 November. Visi dari program studi ini adalah menjadikan program studi yang berkualitas unggul dan berkelas dunia untuk menunjang pembangunan berkelanjutan. Banyak sekali profesor, doktor, dan magister dari berbagai macam ilmu yang menjadi pengajar di program studi ini. Program studi ini juga bekerja sama dengan mitra-mitra pembangunan, pemerintah, universitas, industri, dan lembaga-lembaga pembangunan baik di dalam negeri maupun di luar negeri. Mahasiswa studi pembangunan berkesempatan mendapat beasiswa, melakukan magang, exchange program, penelitian, pengabdian kepada masyarakat, dan kegiatan-kegiatan yang lainnya untuk meningkatkan kompetensi life skill mereka. Mahasiswa kami telah mengukir prestasi sampai ke taraf internasional. Oleh karena itu, mari bergabung dengan program Studi Pembangunan Institut Teknologi 10 November. Mari kita bersama-sama membangun Indonesia yang lebih baik dan berkelanjutan.
Hadirnya program Sarjana Studi Pembangunan menjadi jawaban terhadap kebutuhan akan tenaga terampil bagi pembangunan di Indonesia. Yes, sinergi membangun Indonesia.
Okay, thank you for the committee. Okay, for the participant, don't forget to fulfill the attendance form as shared in chats. So, again, please open your camera, mute your microphone, and sit comfortably. Now we open our main event today. Dev Talks for the 12th series with Prof. Dr. Christian von Lübke, the Head of Southeast Asian Studies, and Management from Hochschule Konstanz Technik, Wirtschaft und Gestaltung, HTWG Konstanz University. Here also, welcome to Miss Yuni Setyaningsih, who will be our moderator for this dev talk. Without wasting our time, let's greet our moderator today, who will lead this discussion with Professor von Lübke. Miss Yuni Setyaningsih, the time is yours.
Okay, so thanks so much, Crystal, for introducing us. Yeah, so good afternoon. I suggest for Professor Christian there in Germany, and good early evening for my students here in Indonesia, and also other participants dari peserta umum. So welcome to Development Talk Series 12. Today, Wednesday, June 7, 2023. In 5 until 6:30 Jakarta time or Western Indonesian time. So today we have a very outstanding guest lecturer from Professor Dr. Christian von Lübke. He will be conducting materials on how do we conceptualize development, ideas of modernizations, dependency, and neoliberalism in comparisons. So before I invite Professor Christian, I would like to introduce his short bio. So as long as I read his biography, so many experience and education's background, but I will try my best to capture in brief. So Professor Christian von Lübke, his education, he took a Bachelor in Business, Political Science, and Sociology in Münster University, 1996. And he also took Japanese Studies program in ICU Tokyo, and he took a master degree in economics in Münster University, and he took PhD in political science in Australian National University, and also postdoc in Stanford University. So his academic position now, he is a full professor in Asian Studies and Management, HTWG Konstanz, and head of Southeast Asian program and project leader. He also a senior research fellow in Arnold there's an institute. I'm sorry, my German pronunciation is very bad. So, but I will try my best. And yeah, and for employment and consultations, he has a lot of experience on that. He lots of experience in GIZ, German Development Corporation in Eastern Indonesia, and also the World Bank Rural Investment Climate Program in Indonesia, and UK Department for International Development in IDS. Again, also GIS in Program Progress Evaluations, then Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, then also Friedrich Ebert Foundations, Berlin, and GIZ also in Project Evaluations, and Winter School Democratic Governance, and also Catholic Central Office for Development Aid, starting to 2018 until now. So yeah, so his professional starting around 2001 until now. So many professional experiences. He also have lots of publications. So I encourage you to have a look and learn from his publications. I find his publications are very interesting, and for my dear students, his publications are also very related for your studies. So I encourage you to also learn from that. And yeah, so he also speak Indonesians, as he shared that he also lived in Indonesia for quite some times, in Jakarta and also at NTB and NTT. So yeah, I was also surprised that his bahasa Indonesia is very good. So, and he also speak Japanese and also English, of course, and also German, and basic skills in Latin, Malay, and French. So, ladies and gentlemen, and my dear students, let's invite Professor Christian here to give his lecture. So please, for my dear student, your assignments today is take notes from Professor Christian lecture, and then you have to submit your notes by tomorrow morning. Okay, so hi, Professor Christian.
Yeah, selamat sore, and thank you
Selamat
for
sore.
the very warm welcome. Terima kasih atas undangan. I'm very honored to be here. I'm very glad to return, this time virtually, to ITS. As I mentioned before in our little chat before, I've been to your beautiful university and I was highly impressed. Thank you also for the videos, MC Christopher, for this great introduction. I really enjoyed my short stay. I also gave some guest lectures in February, but this was more at the engineering part of your university about digital Indonesia and the future forward in Indonesia and its pathway with digitalization and digital disruption. Of course, our topic today is very different. Thank you, Prof. Uni, for introducing me here. You've already heard I have a very strong connection to Indonesia. You could say actually my professional pathway started in Sumba, in the small island of Sumba in NTB in Waingapu, where I started my long journey, which somehow, culminates to the professorship where I'm sitting here today. But it was the small island of Sumba where I had my first experiences with development. I lived with a host family. I worked for GIZ, and I learned about not only local culture, but also how complex, how multifaceted, and how gradual development can be by looking at the local communities, by trying to work my way into understanding slowly Sumba, Apu, but later on Bima in NTB, and then later on also Java, Sumatra, and other places of Indonesia. My PhD, as was mentioned, was a comparative analysis on how did democracy and how did decentralization change governance structures in Indonesia, local governments, Pemda. So some kabupaten perform much better than others, even though the rules were basically the same. And I looked at leadership and civil society pressures of explaining that. There was a mix between development and political science. That was my PhD at ANU. So basically what I want to say, my link to Indonesia is strong. I'm very happy to be here today. All right, today's topic is development. Development, and if we think development today, maybe the first thing that comes to your mind is SDGs and sustainability aspects and perhaps social development, and that is wonderful. But let me just say the pathway of our understanding of development is long, and it is also very multifaceted. So what I want to do today is sketch out, try to explain a little bit how our understanding, our conceptualization of development has actually changed over the course of time. Before I do so, I am a lecturer that likes interaction. Now, I know that in Asian settings, it is not always absolutely normal that students react to my questions and that it takes a little bit of time. But let me just say two things. There are no wrong answers, and you are more than welcome to participate today in any way, and I will ask questions. Now, we're a very big group. I can see we're 80 participants here. So I will use the chat function for interacting with you. That's probably the easiest. If you feel brave enough to raise your hand, put on your video and speak directly at any point of time, you may. Just do so, put on your video and raise your virtual hand, and I hope somebody, MC Christopher or Prof. Uni, will see it and will advise me that there's a question. At any point of time, you may ask anything. That is completely fine with me. But let me really start with a question to set off this participatory spirit here today. Development. you have maybe different ideas, different associations. Could you please share, no matter what comes to your mind, associations? What comes to your mind when you think about the concept of development? Development for me is ... What comes to your mind? Just write simple words, short sentences, any associations that come to your mind into the chat window, please. Let's see who's a fast typer. Is the chat function actually open to all participants? Question?
Yeah, it's open for everyone.
All right.
So yeah, so you guys, if you are have difficulties to speak English, feel free to speak in Bahasa.
That's fine. Or any simple words that come.
Yeah.
To your mind, just share them with us. I just want to get a feeling. Why do I ask this? I want to get a feeling, where does your association here in the group stand if you think about development? And you don't even have to put full sentences. Even thank you very much for the first response here, Ms. Indy. Development for me is a process that creates positive change. Very good. Change, and it ideally is positive. Growth, standard of living. Very nice. What else comes to your mind if you think about development? A big topic, and there's so many different dimensions that may come to your mind.
Yeah.
But just be brave and give me a word. It can be just a word.
Yeah. So maybe I will pick someone here to warm up, right? So can I have Andia here? Andia?
Hello. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Unfortunately, I cannot turn on my video. But
No
if
problem.
I were to answer your question, what is development? I think I'm pretty much in the same. It's pretty much the same answer as everyone else, as my friends. It's a process that creates a change, right? It's something, but more in the positive side. Usually, when we speak about development, is how we change something from maybe some maybe not, we have expectation of what it should be, right? We need to develop maybe our economic into this way, maybe our social life into this way, right? So there's a feeling of not being where it should be, and then the development side, it's like trying to reach the point that where, oh yeah, this is where it should be. So I think, I'm sorry if it's a bit confusing, but yeah, it's a for me, development is starting when you are less and then changing it to be better, as if I were to put it in a simple sentence, I guess.
Thank you, Ms. Andia. That is not confusing. That is an excellent answer, as were the answers before, and they all point in the right direction. And I just wanted us to get a feeling for where we start thinking about development. If we would have been a smaller class, and I hope you can see me now, you can see my presentation now. Is that okay?
Yeah, but it's
Okay.
not full screen yet. So
It is not full screen yet. Yeah, it's a bit of issue here because somehow I have two screens. Let me just see if I can change that. That is still not right. Give me a second. Somehow I have two screens and it jumps around. How do I do that? Go out again. Don't know why, but it splits my screens the first time it does that. Let's try this. Is this now better? No. Let's try this again. Um, this is really annoying. Sorry about this. You still see my notes, right? Well, there are no notes, but you see the next slide. Is that right?
Yes, yes. Or you can
Maybe
share to us, then
I
we
just
can
make them
help.
smaller. Is this better?
Yeah, or you can send the file to us, then we will try to help to share screen your presentation.
But how's this now? Does this work, or is this still bad?
This still looks the same than before. Yeah, still
Okay.
the same.
It's still the same. This is the first time it's done this. Right. Okay. So why don't I send my slides to you?
Yeah.
And then we try that. So we have an intermission of 1 minute or so.
Yeah.
Just do that. Sorry about it. Okay, I send it out. And I think what I'm going to do for the meanwhile is just start. And we can, or is it already in your inbox? Now you're muted, Professor Uni.
Sorry. Yeah, I just received.
Okay, good. Then
Yeah,
I'll wait for you to open it. Sorry about this. There's a technical
No
glitch
problem.
here.
No problem at all.
So I'll indicate with words like next slide or next please to move from one slide to another. Which has now the advantage that you already have my slides if you want to share them later. Some technical problem on your side as well.
Sorry, it takes some time to download. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
MC Christopher, while we're waiting, have you been outside of Indonesia?
Yeah, I'm still here.
So, of course, Indonesia is so beautiful and so diverse that I think development can be fully understood by just looking at the different kabupaten and daerah in Indonesia. But of course, development is also interesting from a comparative perspective, and that's what we're going to try to do today. So welcome again. Sorry for the slight technical difficulties. Mea culpa. So today I would like to take you on a little journey. How has the concept of development traveled across time? We're going to talk about modernization. We're going to talk about dependency and about new versions that still apply to the world as we speak of Neo-Liberalism. And to some extent, it's even intermixing in some contexts here. So, next slide, please. Key questions that we're going to be discussing are: what is it that we call development? What are central themes and issues? How has all this changed, transformed over the course of time? And how are these three concepts that we just mentioned, how can they be understood? Next, please. So usually, next slide, please. I would start in a smaller class, and I thought we would be a bit smaller, with asking you to draw a picture of development, which is lots of fun. So if you can try that after this class, or maybe even in parallel if you wish, but maybe as a small homework, just take a piece of white paper, take 5 minutes of your time, and try to draw development. What comes to your mind? How would you actually summarize your idea of development on a piece of white paper? It's not easy. It's always lots of fun with my students. That's how I usually start, but we're too big of a group to do that in an online forum. Next, please. So some of my students drew large staircases. Development is taking one step at a time. It's about changing from one state into a better state, as we nicely heard just before. It's about growth. It's about transformation. Next, please. But sometimes development cannot always be linear. It can also take certain side turns. It may be even tremendously complicated. Not everybody is able to follow the pathway of development. Some people are left behind, even though we should leave no one behind. All these issues are, of course, part of our development discourse. Next, please. So now I would like you to think about the following pictures. And again, I would urge you, I would encourage you, I would plead you to use your chat windows to just give me 2-3 words what comes in your mind if you see the following picture. Next, please. So development is the development path. You see something here in front of you. If you look at this picture and you think about it, what comes to your mind? You may either open your mic and say something to you, or you're very welcome to type 2-3 words, even in Bahasa Indonesia, tidak apa-apa. You can also write a short comment in Bahasa if you feel like it. There are no mistakes in this class. I'm just very happy for every participation, for every response. Feel free to just open your mic and say something, or write a short sentence. Kalau mau di bahasa Indonesia juga silakan. No issue. So development, one idea. What is development? Look at this picture and what do you feel? What do you see? Let me ask to start this, our MC, if I may, MC Christopher, you see a picture here in front of you. What comes to your mind when you would describe this picture?
Answer your.
Say again?
Can I answer your question?
Yes, please.
Oh, according to my opinion, this picture tells us about how developed countries have the, the knowledge. They have the what is model, like they have like capital, they have many resource they have to become a developed countries, and the developing countries just have to learn from the developed countries. Yeah, and the developed countries shall lead the developing countries to go to the development. I think like that.
Mm-hmm. Very good starting point. And I just had a raising hand from a young
Alia.
lady. Please.
Yeah, it was Alia. Alia, go ahead. Suaranya tidak begitu terdengar.
Is it heardable?
Yes,
Yeah,
now it's
better.
Okay, so I think about these pictures is about developed countries help developing countries to development, to be a better countries like that.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And I
Yeah.
can also read in the chats, I'm reading some here, guiding developing countries. Developed countries will be a reference. Developed country could be affecting other developed country to follow their path. My interpretation about pictures is a country also influenced by other countries. Developed nation increase their influence in developed nation for their own benefit. This is all right. This is all a really good starting point. What and maybe you're far too polite to note this, but what I would like to raise your attention is also the developing nations, even the word developing countries is not really up to date anymore. We usually talk about the global south or about corporations. We also talk a lot about South-South cooperation. The time where there were the advanced nations and the developing nations, I would argue, is pretty much off the table. That used to be that way, but we now understand that development is so multifaceted that some of the mistakes the so-called advanced nations, including my own country, which is here behind me, have done, that we don't only have to share knowledge and blueprints, and we are not only full of knowledge that you can learn from, but we should learn also from you. That's the first statement. And in that sense, even though all your statements are very kind and right, there's another notion here, and that is there is a Western or European arrogance in saying, we have the blueprints and you should follow our blueprints. That is certainly not the way the world should move forward, because especially if we look at climate and nature, we have actually shown that we do not really have the solutions at all. So if you look at places like Bolivia, Indonesia as well, there is a much greater connection to nature and to biodiversity in many ways than we had or we are showing. So in a sense, you're completely right. There is a learning process, and to some extent that is still true, perhaps in some technology areas, in some knowledge areas, education areas, perhaps. But there is always a two-way line, and therefore there's also a critical element in this picture, and that is we should learn together. And developing nations, I wouldn't consider Indonesia a developing nation anymore, because I would say it's an emerging nation. It has already taken many steps forward, but it is nowadays an eye-to-eye process, and we have to learn from each other. And this picture also, if you think a bit more critically, indicates a bit of arrogance from the Euro perspective, and that shouldn't be the case. It should not be the large white European man pulling a dark-skinned global South child behind him and teaching him. It should be two people seeing eye to eye and learning where the pathway of development goes to. Thank you so much for participating. Next slide, please. Here is another point that illustrates my slightly critical angle of development. There's a reason why Amsterdam is so beautiful, why the houses of Amsterdam, especially the old houses, are so splendid. And that is because Amsterdam profited very strongly, as you well know, from the spice trade, from the Malaccas, from Indonesia. For many centuries, the Western nations have taken resources from other countries under the realm of colonialism and imperialism and have built their economies. They have, through these riches, also built their education and technology spheres. So yes, we are sometimes a couple of steps ahead, but the story that has to be told, and that is a historical story, is one of inequality and colonial depletion, or colonial, let's say, you could call it theft. And you can see this Africa here, and that's often mentioned, has been completely robbed of its natural resources, especially from Europe and from the United States, not only in terms of physical resources, gold, jewels, tin, copper, timber, but also human resources. You know that African Americans are in the United States for a reason, because they're connected to human resource theft, in other words, slavery. So the story about development is a long one, and it's not only a pretty one, it's also one that is very controversial, because some countries have actually taken away things from other countries for a long time. Next slide, please. And of course, there is the issue, if we talk about development, about context. We, the World Bank, GIZ, many organizations for a long time have tried to teach our blueprints. And many of these blueprints or knowledges or ideas or concepts are very valuable, no doubt. But we also have to understand that development in each circumstance, in each country, in each even sometimes district, is to be placed into the context. These contexts are social, they're sometimes economic, they are certainly political. And if you don't understand a country or a location, it's very difficult to apply some of these concepts one-to-one from one country to another. So here, this African man says, can you help me without forcing me to become like you or follow your way of life? Because after all, dear Western development worker, I am not like you. I think differently. I come from a different background, from a different context. Next slide, please. And last but not least, we of course see that different countries in the world find it more or less difficult to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The good news is that these goals nowadays do not only apply to the development realm or to the global south, but even Western countries, OECD countries, are now asked to think about their climate budgets, their own problems, their consumer patterns, so that mirror is now also in Europe, not only in the global south. That's a good part, but still many countries find it difficult to achieve all these goals at the same time. Next slide, please. And one last slide here. We also know that in almost all nations, and this applies very much also to Asia, one of the major objectives of development is growth. And there's nothing bad, particularly about growing and stimulating, strengthening the economy. We all know this is important, because if we don't have a bigger pie, we can't really share the pie with others either. So some amount of growth is important, no doubt, especially if we have population growth, we also need economic growth. Otherwise, in net terms we would be reducing. But we also know that very fast growth comes at a cost. And recently we can see this a lot, that very fast and very rapid growth comes at the cost of nature, comes at the cost of sustainability. And that's what this picture is trying to depict here. Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, now I gave you some general thoughts, which were more like a warm-up. What I would like to do now, how many minutes do we actually have, Prof. Uni, so that I have a feeling for the next couple of slides?
Yeah, we still have 20 minutes.
20 minutes, so we're going to speed up. And we're maybe going to jump over some slides a bit faster. So the history of development is long and it is complex. Next slide, please. What are major schools of development thinking? Next. So if we look at an overview, there are many theories that have developed since the 1950s, since the big world wars were over. And you can see some of the names here. Next slide, please. But we today will focus on three, and that is from the 1950s after World War II, particularly in the US, and particularly out of Harvard University came modernization theory. That was one of the first development discourses that we find in the literature in the post-war time. And then as a response to modernization came dependency, as a response from Latin America, to keep it simple. And over time, and what is still valid to some extent, came a much stronger focus on markets. And that's what I summarize under the focus of neoliberalism. And let me try to introduce you in 20 minutes, which is fast, the rough contours of these concepts. Next, please. And next, please. So, the first idea about modernization was from Harvard professor Rustow, and he noted in one of his important books, it is possible to identify all societies in their economic dimensions as lying within one of 5 categories. So almost like steps. The traditional society, 1, the preconditions for takeoff, 2, the takeoff, 3, the drive to maturity, 4, and the age of mass consumption, 5. Next slide, please. And here you see these steps again. This was Rustow's idea. Societies can be categorized according to development steps. And these early ideas from Harvard professor Rustow were also instructive for our idea of underdevelopment and advanced nations. So nations were like steps. They were going from A to B and they were climbing. What was really bad in Rustow's idea was to be traditional. What was really bad was to have lots of cultural, traditional, mystical, Kejawen, if you wish, these kind of angles where tradition and mysticism meets with society. This was seen by Rustow as something that was not good for development. That was a lower step of development. You had to get rid of tradition and move forward. You had to industrialize. You had to add education. You should add more companies, more infrastructure, more schools, and you should let go of old traditions. And the beauty of this process in his eyes in the 1950s was at some point you end up in this beautiful high stage of mass consumption. Wow. Time has changed. Now we understand that somebody living a sustainable life that is connected to local traditions in the forest of Bolivia may be much more sustainable than somebody living in a skyscraper and producing lots of plastic and being at the high point of mass consumption. Times have changed because we have more reflected. But the early ideas of development were very stage-related and very linear. You can go from A to B to C to E if you industrialize, educate, put more infrastructure, become more urbanized, and let go of nature and tradition, basically. Times have changed, but these were the old and early ideas of development in the post-war years coming out of the US and especially Harvard University. Thank you. Next. So here again, for you, you can also read it later in the slides that will be shared. You can see the different steps. You start with basic subsistence farming, lots of traditional ways of living. You then move to more commercial agriculture. That's the second step. In the third, in this takeoff, you industrialize. You move out of rural into urban areas. You experience rapid growth. And you improve, this is step 4, the industries. You have more sophistication, more complex education, transport, and infrastructures. And at the end, your industry shifts to be really ready to produce high technology goods and mass consumption. That was his ideas in the 1950s. Next, please. This idea was very much influenced, and that's why I also said before, blueprints can be helpful, but they don't always work. This was a blueprint coming out of the own experience in the United States, coming from the Pilgrim Fathers, going with the different settlers west, having more commercial agriculture as they moved, having train tracks towards California, having industrialization, more urbanization, and then in the between and after the wars, maturing and moving in the post-war years to mass consumption, or perhaps even before that. But this was the US story, which was put in a blueprint and actually promoted to the world. It is not wrong, but it may not cover the complexity of development. Next, please. I will skip the next 4 slides, I think. So next. There's a discussion to what extent development and democracy are linked. Next, please. But we'll skip over that because I'm running slightly low in time. Next, please. Okay. Now, after modernization, we were reaching a point in the 1970s where the question was on the table, have these ideas, these blueprints from Rustow, these stage models, these modernization ideas, did they solve poverty? Did they really create a world which was equally growing and poverty was sinking? And the clear answer was no, it did not. Next, please. If you looked at the world in the 1980s or so, this is the normal map. Next, please. But if you actually weigh the map in terms of GDP in purchasing power parity, you could actually see even today, this is now 2015, that the world is a very unequal place. We all know that, but basically if we weigh in terms of GDP or per capita income, it looks similar. You will actually find that there are a couple of countries which are very well off, and there are a lot of countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, partially in Latin America, South Asia, even Southeast Asia, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, have still high levels of poverty. We are not in an equal world, and we have not solved the poverty level. Actually, with COVID and other problems, even the Ukraine war, we're just coming into a world where poverty is rising or not sinking at all, but poverty problems are becoming even more pronounced as they were before. Next, please. So if you look at poverty today, as I mentioned before, you can see the world is still a very unequal place. Next, please. So despite modernization efforts, urbanization, education, trying to tell countries, this is the kind of blueprint, this is the kind of instruction, you can move in this direction. It was still not easy, and it still didn't solve the poverty problem. Of course not, because it's much more deep-rooted. And the next field of theories or concepts are doing just that. They're trying to understand, why do some countries in Africa, in Latin America, why do they find it so difficult to grow, to develop? And the answer is history. Next, please. So here's a European colonialist striding, perhaps Belgian, striding all across Africa. What it indicates is Africa was never Africa, and African states were never these states, but it was mostly European colonial powers that actually divided Africa, drew the lines, and created states. These states are, some of them, very young. In the 1950s to 1980s, some of these countries have emerged in Africa. And of course, they emerged after a very long and painful colonial history. Indonesia has its own painful colonial history, I would argue. Not only painful, but also there were lots of resources taken away. Africa is a much more pronounced and sad story to tell, because Africa really has a long and painful colonial history. Next, please. So if you look at history and put it together with modernization, you have to say, well, these steps of modernization are interesting and fine, and they make sense. But what if some countries have been actually exploited for many, many decades, perhaps hundreds of years? Their resources have been taken, and then they are just starting to be a country in the 1950s to the 1970s, and they have very weak governance. They're just starting to be a country, and then the world expects them to develop. That is not fair. And this is basically the line of development of dependency theories. And here's a quote from one of the very famous proponents of dependencia or dependence theories, Andre Gunnar Frank, and he says, economic development and underdevelopment are the opposite faces of the same coin. Both are necessary result of the contemporary situation of internal contradictions in the world system, and this system is capitalist. The historical development of the capitalist systems have generated underdevelopment in the peripheral satellites whose economic surplus was expropriated, which means taken away, while generating economic development in the centers of the world. So basically, next slide, please. Basically, we see a world where some of the centers have taken away resources for a long point of time. Here's just a point where you can see which parts of the world had which colonial background and were decolonializing. Next, please. The origins of this theory could have been in Africa, but Africa was still very much emerging and very much concerned with creating states. Latin America was much more advanced and had already much higher education systems. So some intellectuals in Latin America came up in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s and said, modernization only tells half of the story. The other half of the story that needs to be told is development is a matter of colonial history, and it is a matter of whether countries are exploited or not. So this was the new kind of critique. It was more a critique. It was not really a theory. Next slide, please. And we can jump over that. Do we still find imbalances in the world today? I would argue, yes, we do. There's still some countries that are very much in the core of our economic system. Certainly the two major ones, the US and China, and certainly the OECD world, that is Europe, Japan, South Korea, Canada, and others. And sub-Saharan Africa is still somewhat in the periphery. Sub-Saharan Africa still sells most of its raw materials without generating much value. These materials are used to produce high-level goods in the more advanced world. And also, the Global South gives very cheap labor to produce these goods. But the value, still even today, most of the value is still in the gravitational centers and economic centers of the world. So this logic still holds to some extent, even though it has slightly improved in some regions in the world. Next, please. Where do we find the rich core and where do we find the poor periphery? You can see it in the blue and red colors here. Basically, it reiterates, it reviews what we just discussed. Some parts of the world are still left behind and are still providing more raw materials and more cheap labor, while other places, for instance, Singapore, doesn't have any resources, doesn't have much human resources either. It's a relatively small country, but it is one of the richest countries in the world. So it produces lots of value, which is not a bad thing. But ideally, the entire world moves up to a point where they would actually be as effective in producing values as Singapore. But at this point, still many countries are at a point where they just export their raw materials and provide their cheap labor for this global value chains. Next, please. So, according to dependency theory, modernization theory is good and well. It's a good first step, but it really misses the point that the international trade system is still imbalanced, and it misses the point that colonial history has really left some of these countries on a much lower point, and that not everybody has the same conditions. Many are still struggling with their history, and many are still struggling with unequal trade relations or unequal value generation. This is basically the core of dependency theory. So it is a critical theory that makes you think about how complex development can be. Now, what is missing in dependency theory? Well, the answer here would be, so modernization theory was mostly about internal factors. To grow, a country needs to change. It has to let go of tradition. It has to urbanize, industrialize, lay infrastructure, become better. It was an internal struggle to become stepwise better and to make the best of what you have. And please do not get stuck with old traditions. Those are key ideas of the 50s of modernization theory. Dependency says, well, it's not internal all that much, it's a lot external. It's external colonial forces which actually took our resources away, and it's external trade relations which keep being unfair. So the problem of development is external imbalance or external unfairness, historical as well. Okay. And now if we come to the last theory, we would say, well, dependency is all about history and all about external, but isn't there something to say about why did Singapore become so successful? Why did Japan become so successful, even though they started from zero, from a similar level at some point, without many resources? How did they do it? And now we come to the last theory, and that is Neo-Liberalism, that I want to present today. Next, please. So Neo-Liberalism, and which is sometimes in the development discourse summarized as the Washington Consensus, basically complains about all these, let's say, concerns about everything is external, and again turns the focus internal, but this time not into a step idea, but it basically puts out the idea or the notion development is the best if we let markets do their work. We need more markets and less state. So what Washington and different development agencies in the 1970s, 80s, 90s were observing is that many states in Africa were highly corrupt, were highly ineffective. We had states in Latin America in debt crisis. We had big financial crisis all over the world in the 70s and 80s. Looking at that, the idea was states have lots of problems and big bureaucracies, and some of these states in Africa have really bad leaders that give the positions to their cousins and sons, and there's lots of nepotism, and all this is not good. So having too much state is not a good idea. We need more markets. Next slide, please. So next slide, please. These two actors were actually at the center in the 1980s of the neoliberal shift. You can see the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher, and the then President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. So Reagan and Thatcher, from the political side, and from the economic or development side, it was the economist Milton Friedman, Chicago University, which then said, okay, this is enough. Development doesn't make sense the way we think about it. Development has to be development of markets, development of free trade, development of opening up borders, exchanging goods, building industries, pushing private sector development, local economic development. Everything economic was important. Markets were important. And please let the government step back. Next slide, please. So too much state in the economic realm leads to inefficiency. It leads to slower growth. So let's get the state involvement out. This was promoted by the World Bank and the IMF very heavily in the 1980s, 90s, and even early 2000s a bit. And they called it the so-called structural adjustment policies. So the World Bank and the IMF in these years were saying, dear Ghana, dear Burkina Faso, dear Bolivia, you need a credit? Fine, we'll give you a credit. But before we give you the credit, please change your state companies into public companies. Please reduce your bureaucracy. Please become more open to trade. So basically what they were saying, please get your state back and get your markets forward. That was basically the message of these institutions in the 80s and 90s. Next slide, please. So it was all about liberalization. That means opening up trade, no tariffs, no borders of trade, getting trade and investment in, liberalization. It was all about privatization. Many companies have state enterprises. You also have that in Indonesia, and it makes sense to have some state enterprises for public goods. But many countries in Africa and Latin America had lots and lots of state enterprises, and they were heavy and they were somehow ineffective. So the answer from the World Bank and IMF was, get rid of your state companies, make them private, and stop regulating, start interfering with regulations into the markets. Less state, more market was actually the motto. Next slide, please. I'll jump over this.
Next slide.
Yes. Did it work? Did it work that we now asked African and Latin American and perhaps South Asian countries to open their trade, to reduce their state companies, to become more market-oriented? The answer is complicated. In some cases, to some extent, yes, and especially in the emerging markets, or let's say more agile markets, I think Vietnam is a case where it did work. There was lots of neoliberal shift under the Doi Mo. Of course, Japan in its early years, South Korea, Taiwan, it worked. But if you look most of the less well-to-do countries, the problem is if you privatize a big public company with thousands of employees from a state company, you say, okay, we're going to privatize this telecommunication company, let's say 10,000 employees. You privatize this, perhaps 9,000 of these employees are fired and 1,000 of these employees are retained. That means in the short run, you have lots of unemployment and more poverty. And you have to be a strong economy with a good education system. And you have to have very good politicians, a very good policy to make this work. The problem was there was just a directive, be more market-oriented, privatize, open your trade. Sounds great, trade open, but the problem is all the Western companies came in, were much more competitive, and the local companies could not compete and were also sinking. So in the short term, many of these less well-to-do countries in the global south, they actually in the short run and even in the mid-run did not see any gains. They actually lost. They had more issues and they didn't solve their poverty problem through this market orientation either. I think the easy answer is market orientation is very good, but it needs to be gradual and it needs to be connected at a state where you're strong enough to open up your trade borders and where you're strong enough to, if you privatize, to find new work for your public company employees into the market. You have to have good education system, you have to have good employment strategies and so forth. Skill developments, yeah. So basically, the bottom line was, no, it did not really work fully. It was more, again, controversial than beneficial to some parts of the world. Next slide, please. And there's another point that is worth noting. Japan, South Korea, today China, are countries which are economically highly successful, but they did not do this in this no state only market fashion. If you think about it, state intervention in early Japan was tremendous. In early South Korea in its development process was also fundamental. And China, we don't have to discuss about. They still have lots of state intervention in their economy. So Asia is actually an example that state intervention, once it is a smart intervention, can actually go hand in hand with fast development. So this mantra of neoliberalism, no state, lots of market, works well in the United States, in the UK, in some parts of Europe, perhaps in some history parts of Asian development, but it did not work well in sub-Saharan Africa. And some parts of Asia really also had more intervention from state than this neoliberal paradigm, this neoliberal thought would actually predict. Thank you. Next slide. What is missing here? Of course, again, my argument would be we have to put things together. Which problems remain unaddressed? And I think we can close the presentation. Which we can go back into a gallery view. If you see these different concepts, and there was lots of information today, you can say each of these perspectives tell a certain story of development and a certain part of the truth. Development has something to do with internal development. Building education, building infrastructure. You're very much doing that in Indonesia right now. Beautiful ports, great highways, that is important. Urbanization can bring economic impulses. Could you close the presentation for me, Professor Yumi? then we can look each other in the gallery view. That's more, yeah, thank you. So modernization theory has a value. It understands how countries move from A to B. But what we also learn, and that was also in the picture with the spiral, development is never linear. Development is complicated. And it is particularly complicated, and that is when dependency theory comes in, if we have complicated histories. Was the country depleted of its resources? If so, of course it cannot develop as fast as a country which still has access to its resources, or countries who don't have a good state yet because they still live in conflict or civil war, partially also because history. Of course, they don't develop. So the stages are great, but they're just a rough idea what could happen. But we need to put history and context into the equation. So you have to combine modernization and dependency theory to understand development. And lastly, is state or is market important? Both, I would argue. So liberal theories tell you, neoliberal theories or the Washington consensus still tells you from American perspectives, markets are much more important than state. I'm an economist by training, so I believe in markets. There's nothing wrong with believing in markets. I'm sure you also believe markets are important. Trade, open trade, building economic centers, that's all important. But a good state that actually corrects market failures, because yes, markets fail. We can see that the nature is suffering around us. And that's one reason for this is because markets fail. We don't price in the lack of biodiversity. We don't price in that we put plastic in our oceans. That is not in the markets. So again, the last point, stages, internal development, fine, not linear complexity of history. And lastly, we need both state and markets to have development. And if you put these three theories together in your mind, you have a first, albeit quite complex, but I would say quite comprehensive first idea, what development is. And I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Prof. Christian, for a very comprehensive lecture. And I hope my students learned a lot from your presentations. And now I would like to open the Q&A sessions. Anyone, please raise your hand to ask questions. Yeah, I have Dava here. Dava, go ahead.
Hello, Miss Yuni and Mr. Luke.
Christian.
Yeah. So yeah, we meet again because I met Miss Yuni back in Technopreneur class. Yes. Okay, I'm from. My name is Dava. I come from computer engineering department. Well, actually, my question was the East Asian miracle in countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China, etc., because there is a state involvement. Do you think that the state involvement in Indonesia, like especially about the hilarization of some of the natural or rare resource industry, can help to increase the economic growth? Because from my understanding,
I didn't understand that. The last sentence, the what of natural resources? The
hilarization.
Hilarization
of downstream of the industry. Sorry. The downstream of the industry.
To create more value of the industry in Indonesia. Okay.
Yes. To increase the ability of Indonesian engineering sector.
Yes.
And from your understanding also, do you think that the industrialization of Indonesia should involve from the FDI, the foreign direct investment? Because if we relied on local sector, I think we didn't have much money for to do that. So what's your perspective on it? Because I think the competition in Asia was a very, very tight competition, yeah. Because from my perspective, our biggest competitor in Southeast Asia is Vietnam. Vietnam is our biggest competitor in terms of their kind of economic growth, and because we're on the same level as developing countries, but they, from my understanding, much more have achieved more from the foreign direct investment than Indonesia. So what's your perspective on that?
These are at least 3 questions. Thank you so much, Mohammed. And it's nice to see you again. So the first question I identified was, did state involvement help the Asian miracle, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and so forth? And the answer is yes. I would argue it did help their development, but there's a big but. It's never easy. Answers are never easy. They always need to be qualified. Yes, state intervention helped, but it was smart state intervention. It was a smart state. And what do I mean? It is a state that operates actually with a clear idea. So Singapore is similar. You provide tax breaks, you provide subsidies, you provide industrial policies, but you tell your actors that it's going to be for 10 years, 15 years, perhaps 20 years, but you give an exit strategy. So Samsung used to be an agricultural commercial company without any value many years back, but the South Korean government had the idea we're going to create this into a high technology company, and they provide greenfield, tax breaks, resources, technology transfer, and lots of things. But they were always clear, dear Samsung, we can give you all this, but in 10 years we want to see results. And in 20 years, these subsidies will subside, they will be gone. So get ready, make your best efforts. If you do it like in Congo, and the president gets his brother and says, oh, you run this state company and I'm going to shoot over 100 million every year and we're going to do this 50, 100 years, don't worry about it. There is no effort and there's nothing happening. That's also state involvement, but there is no exit strategy. There's no targets. So state involvement is good if it's done in a smart way. And Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and others have been very good in fine-tuning and thinking about good industrial policy, but it has to be thought through. So I believe in a good state, but it has to be a good and smart state. If it's a corrupt and a bloated state, it will be the opposite effect. So Neo-Liberalism and Washington Consensus was not all wrong. There were lots of corrupt and bloated bad states around the world, and they wanted to push the markets in. But again, that also was not the solution. You need to build a good state, and here we come again to colonial history. Good states usually build through time, through peace, through stability. And if you have a bad history, well, bad luck. You have to start over again. So states who are successful and have very good capacities are usually those who have gone through a certain period of stability and who have great leaders, who have good bureaucracies, who have clear ideas. So the first answer, sorry, this is only your first question, is state intervention, yes, but the right kind of state intervention. Then we have a question about downstream and, let's say, trying to create value inside a country. My answer would be similar to the first answer. Yes, absolutely. But please, with exit strategies. If you support, fantastic, but have a clear idea that this is driving efficiency and innovation and not collusion. Because if this becomes, as we can see in some other emerging countries or sub-Saharan African cases, of course you can provide support to industries, and that's fantastic. But have a clear strategy how you do it and how you maybe fade out subsidies and support over time. Same applies to tariffs, right? So we have tariffs in Indonesia that some things can go in, some things go out, but not to a certain extent. Tariffs are there. That's also okay for a while if you have a strategy. So supporting, securing your own industry for a short period of time, Japan did it, South Korea did it, many countries did it, but let's be careful not to do this for a long time without having any efficiency gains and value gains. So again, the answer is yes, but have a good strategy in doing so. And yes, I was in Vietnam just 2 weeks ago, and they are a tremendously competitive country coming up. I was at VinFast, the most advanced car producing compound in Southeast Asia, probably. They produce cars that are similar to BMW these days, and now are transforming to electrical vehicles. It was very impressive. Vietnam is very much rising. Can I leave it there, Mohammed?
Yes, the answer is very satisfying. Thank you, Prof, for your answer, and thank you, Mas Juni, to udah mengizinkan saya untuk.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dava. I think you are my students in Technopreneur class, if I'm not mistaken, last year. Oh yeah, so it's so good to see you again, Dava. So yeah, I remember you. Okay, so thanks so much, Dava. Very good questions and very critical questions. Thanks so much. Move on to the second questions. Yeah, Neo, go ahead.
So yeah, hello, proper. My name is Amadis Tristan Medina. I'm from Development Studies. And this is probably similar to previous question. So what's your exact opinion of ordoliberalism? Because as we know previously, neoliberalism focused on more market economy and less state intervention. So basically, ordoliberalism is limited state intervention and adhere to the market principle. And if ordoliberalism is actually a good choice for certain heavy state intervention countries such as sub-Saharan Africa.
You were mentioning the expression ordoliberalism or neoliberalism?
I'm talking about what's your opinion on ordoliberalism, because ordoliberalism is basically a limited state intervention that still adhere to the market principle, while neoliberal more focus on market economy. And based on your statement earlier that sometimes state involvement is important and need to deregulate in long period, and smart state, what your opinion of ordoliberalism in general?
Yes, Amadeus, that's an excellent question. Ordoliberalism, as you nicely outlined already, is actually a moderate form of market orientation, one that accepts a certain involvement of the state. I'm born in the city of Freiburg in Germany, and some of the original thinkers of ordoliberalism are actually from Freiburg University. So there's an expression of the Freiburg School, so it connects me also to my home. Ordoliberalism, I think, is a very interesting concept, and to some extent Germany is built on a thinking of ordoliberalism, because we have something called a social market democracy or a social market system, where we say, yes, we believe in markets completely, but markets sometimes fail. They fail with natural resources, they fail with externalities, they fail with different parts where they just don't provide the right results. So markets are fantastic, and they're often the most efficient way to let economies interact. No doubt, every economist will agree, but markets have limits. And for these limits, we need a good state, a smart state, a well-functioning, clean, prudent state. So order liberalism for me is a good way forward because it actually seeks, if you wish, all the things I was putting together, a bit of modernization, a bit critical thinking from dependency, and a balance of state and market. If you wish, I haven't thought about it that way, but order liberalism connects these things. And I think Indonesia is also on a path. I mean, if you look at the Sukarno early discourses, you can see a criticism of pure market thinking. Let's put it this way. So the economy rakyat, the kind of, we can't only think about markets, was very much present in the Sukarno years. Still in Indonesia, I think there's a certain skepticism of pure neoliberalism. And I guess that's healthy. At the same time, we know we need markets. So that's all important. So basically, I think, yes, an order liberal course broadly is not a bad idea forward. You need a good, strong, functioning state. You need free markets. You have to work this together. You have to be cognizant of your past. You know that some things take time because also Indonesia was depleted of resources in some ways and had a difficult colonial history. And some things took time, same as many countries, including my own. And still it's important to build infrastructure and education. Some modernization ideas are still valid. So putting this all together very much makes sense. I hope this answers your question.
Okay, thank you for the answer. It's satisfying.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks to you and Prof. Christian also for your answers. Next questions. I'd like to invite next questions. You may raise your hand.
It can also be something completely different that's on your mind to anything you heard today.
Yeah. Okay, so I would like to invite the freshman class here because before it's yeah. Can I invite Hilmi? Hilmi, freshman year.
Okay.
Yeah, can go ahead, Hilmi.
I'm sorry. For is this a question, Bu Yuni?
Yes.
For what
anything that comes to your mind. If you have any question while listening to me for the last 90 or so minutes, anything that's on your mind.
Anything that's on my mind. Sometimes, maybe if I use bahasa Indonesia, is it okay?
Silakan.
Sure.
Terkadang saya tuh berpikir bahwa negara berkembang justru malah terkesan bahwa ditindas oleh banyak negara-negara maju. Dalam hal ini memang sudah ada paham-paham yang dilaksanakan, akan tetapi paham-paham tersebut mungkin tidak berjalan sangat maksimal. Oleh karena itu, paham-paham tersebut apakah mungkin dapat mengubah berbagai macam pemahaman yang lain gitu, ataukah pemahaman-pemahaman tersebut harus terus diperbarui untuk kedepannya? Terima kasih.
Should I translate it for you, or is it okay for
you?
You
may summarize. I think I got it, but I'm not 100% sure. So if you want to summarize it in one sentence, That would be helpful.
All right. So he is wondering. I mean, he has been thinking why like the developed worlds are kind of like, you know, told what to do for the developing countries. And he is kind of thinking, is there any other way to change that, or in a better way, or how should we move from that?
That's also what I roughly understood. So thank you very much. I would say there are a number of things happening at the same time. The first thing, who's telling whom what to do depends on power. It's not a matter only on developed or underdeveloped, but power is partly a matter of economic power, also military power, political geostrategic power. But there are a couple of countries that are really powerful in this world. And certainly the United States and China are two centers right now that are rather powerful. So they will continue to tell the world what they think. Other centers are rising. The BRICS states, so we have Brazil, Russia, and infamously right now in the news, but normally Russia. We have India, we have Indonesia rising, we have Turkey, we have South Africa, we have different countries that are also more and more powerful, at least in their region. Indonesia, I think, plays a big role in ASEAN. It's the largest economy. It has a voice. Maybe it doesn't even make use of its voice as much as it could, but it has a voice. So who's telling what? I think first the answer is those who have power, either globally or regionally, will tell others what they think and what is right. Second part of the answer, is that right? No, I think absolutely not. I think nobody should tell anybody what to do. I think there should be a learning process. Development agencies always talk about lessons and lessons learned and exchanging experiences, and that's good. And we should continue doing that. And not top down, but actually eye to eye. It doesn't always work because those places who give funding usually feel more powerful and usually push also their interests because they are those who give money. That's still a problem. And last part of my answer would be there's some emerging countries that have understood that most of the discourses on development don't matter to them. So look at Bolivia or Ecuador, for instance. They have decided to write in their constitution that the buen vivir, the good life, the pursuit of happiness in synchronicity or in harmony with nature, with resources, is what they want. They don't want only growth. They want actually harmony. They want harmony, they want some growth, but they want to maintain their biodiversity. And they have written that in their constitution. So they don't want any blueprints anymore. They say, okay, we have our own idea of development, and that is very much connected to our own tradition. Our belief in the beauty of our land, our belief in our nature and our resources is equally important than your blueprint. So maybe we look at your blueprints and your advice, but we have our own ideas. And I think that's a very good and it's a very laudable movement. I think each country should look at all these advice and take some of the investment. Of course, all the things we discussed before, have a strong state, open market, education, be critical of the past, that's all good. But also to look about one's own strategy, one's own resources, and find one's own idea of development. I think that's important. Having the blueprints and having the own view of your own context. So Bolivia and Ecuador are interesting cases. So is Bhutan, by the way, with its happiness index. But of course, these are very specific places, especially Bhutan is rather small and special, and they get all their energy from water, and many things are very specific in Bhutan. But looking at these places, Bhutan, Ecuador, Bolivia, perhaps other spaces that I don't know of, they would give you the answer, Amadeus, and they would say, no, we don't have to be lectured top down by anybody. We can think about ourselves, about our development and where we want to go. I hope this serves as an answer.
Yeah, thanks so much. Hilmi, tadi benar pertanyaannya begitu? Ya.
Ya, Bu. Ya.
Okay.
Oh,
Thank
sorry,
you.
Hilmi. Amadeus. I apologize. Hilmi.
Yeah.
What? Okay.
I apologize for not mentioning your name correctly. By Hilmi, sorry.
No problem, sir. Thank you for a valuable answer, sir.
Okay, thank you, Hilmi. Okay, so I guess because we are running out of time, I guess that's the Q&A sessions. Thanks so much for Dafa and then Dio and also Hilmi for your questions, and also all the participants who already participated during the Professor Christian sessions. So again, thanks so much, Professor Christian, for spending your time to give a very valuable guest lecture to my students here, and I'm sure they learned a lot from you. So for the next agenda, I would like to give back the sessions to Crystal. The time is yours.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you to our great speaker, Professor von Lübke, and moderator today, Miss Uni. Yeah, such a spectacular speech we have heard today. Yeah. So actually, by learning this concept of development, we might feel more understanding and become more broadly thinking about why, what, and how development is. Next session, giving e-certificate to our honorable speaker, Professor Dr. von Lübke. Thank you for being our DevTalk speaker. Today, I invite Miss Uni to turn on the camera and start giving the e-certificate. Don't forget to stay for seconds as we'll also take pictures. Please, the operator to stand by. Okay. Okay.
Hey, so again, thanks so much, Professor Christian, for your outstanding guest lecture and to sharing your experience to our students. And on behalf of Dr. Arfan Fahmi, as the head of Development Studies Department, we would like to present a certificate of appreciations for your outstanding guest lecture today. With us, Department of Development Studies, Faculty of Creative Design and Digital Business, Institut Teknologi 10 November ITS Surabaya, today, June 7th, 2023. So, yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I'm very honored, and I really enjoyed the talk with all of you today.
Yeah, thank you. So back to you again, Crystal.
Okay, now the documentation with all participants. So all participants, please turn on your camera. Yeah, give your big smile to Professor von Lübke. Okay, please the operator to stand by. Okay. Wow, look at your big smiles, guys. Hey, come on, come on. Wow, we have a lot of slides today. Come on, guys. Please open your camera.
Nice to see you all.
Oke, ini mungkin udah bisa dimulai ya buat dokumentasinya. Ini buat slide 1 ya, 1, 2, 3. Slide 2, 1, 2, 3. Slide 3. 1, 2, 3. Oke, karena yang di slide udah nggak ada yang on cam, mungkin untuk dokumentasi bisa dicukupkan. Thank you.
Terima kasih.
Thank you for the operator. Okay, so since we have already finished our events dev talk today, I sincerely thank all the people who helped to prepare all things for the dev talk today, and I thank all the participants who had spared their time and joined this event. I wish that you have the benefit of this event. Don't forget to fill out the feedback form so we can make the next dev talks better. So my closing statement is the German saying I know from a Carmelite sister here. It says, "Blühe, wo du geflossen bist, bloom wherever you land." See you on the next Dev Talks. It is a pleasure for me to lead this event. I regret all my faults in my words and my works. On the next stage. Bye-bye.
Indonesia adalah negeri agraris dan maritim dengan luas total wilayah lebih 7,8 juta kilometer dan total penduduknya lebih dari 270 juta jiwa. Dikenal sebagai negeri yang subur makmur dan gemah ripaloh jinawi, tentunya Indonesia juga tidak lepas dari permasalahan pembangunan yang multidimensional. Kecanggihan teknologi serta ketersediaan sumber daya alam saja tidak akan menjamin tercapainya keberhasilan pembangunan. Kebijakan dalam pembangunan tidak seharusnya hanya menitikberatkan sisi sains dan teknologi, akan tetapi juga mengintegrasikan dimensi manusia maupun dimensi sosial. Melalui pengembangan social engineering dan pendekatan multidisipliner dengan diperkuat oleh dukungan multi-stakeholder menjadi daya dorong kreativitas serta inovasi sesuai dengan kepentingan kemanusiaan serta memenuhi kebutuhan pembangunan yang berkelanjutan. Untuk itu, diperlukan modal sumber daya manusia dan didukung oleh ekosistem sosial yang kondusif. Modal sosial harus dipersiapkan melalui penyediaan sumber daya manusia yang terlatih dan terdidik.
Selamat datang di program Studi Pembangunan Fakultas Desain Kreatif dan Bisnis Digital Institut Teknologi 10 November. Visi dari program studi ini adalah menjadikan program studi yang berkualitas unggul dan berkelas dunia untuk menunjang pembangunan berkelanjutan. Banyak sekali profesor, doktor, dan magister dari berbagai macam ilmu yang menjadi pengajar di program studi ini. Program studi ini juga bekerja sama dengan mitra-mitra pembangunan, pemerintah, universitas, industri, dan lembaga-lembaga pembangunan baik di dalam negeri maupun di luar negeri. Mahasiswa studi pembangunan berkesempatan mendapat beasiswa, melakukan magang, exchange program, penelitian, pengabdian kepada masyarakat, dan kegiatan-kegiatan yang lainnya untuk meningkatkan kompetensi life skill mereka. Mahasiswa kami telah mengukir prestasi sampai ke taraf internasional. Oleh karena itu, mari bergabung dengan program Studi Pembangunan Institut Teknologi 10 November. Mari kita bersama-sama membangun Indonesia yang lebih baik dan berkelanjutan.
Hadirnya program Sarjana Studi Pembangunan menjadi jawaban terhadap kebutuhan akan tenaga terampil bagi pembangunan di Indonesia. Program Studi Pembangunan ITS, Sinergi Membangun Indonesia.